Hi, everybody. Welcome to this YA speculative fiction debuts for the summer, which is probably the most original and innovative title I've made since I started doing these panels. I'm so excited to be chatting with all of these fantastic debuts. If you don't know who I am, my name is Lily. I'm the moderator for this panel and kind of like the face behind Utopia's State of Mind on the internet. We're going to have our panelists introduce themselves, and then we're going to start with the questions that I have. If you have any questions during the chat, you can use the chat box and submit your questions at any time, and I will remember to go back to them at the end when we have answering questions. So Markel, do you want to start?
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Markel Graybo. I'm the debut author of Call for the Fox, which is a queer reimagining of the grim fairy tale Snow White and Rose Red. And it follows a 15-year-old girl named Ro who saves a fox from an attacking bear, only to realize that that bear is actually a boy cursed by fairies with no memory of who he is. All he knows is that he has to kill the fox. So to protect the fox and make her forest safe again, Ro works with her sister Erwin to break the curse and also find some romance along the way.
Hey all, I'm Dinesh Tharu. I'm the debut author of Into the Sunken City, which is very small right there. Into the Sunken City is about two sisters, Jin and Tara, who are everyone in the world to each other. They live on a future Earth that has had something of a climate disaster. It is always raining. Sea levels have risen more than 4,000 feet. And their parents are both gone. They don't have a lot of money. And one fine day, a strange drifter shows up claiming to know of a huge hoard of gold hidden in the sunken ruins of Las Vegas. It's a retelling of Robert Louis Stevenson's classic Treasure Island. And I'm excited to chat lots more about it with y'all.
Hi, my name is Vanessa. I wrote The Last Blood Carver. I don't have a copy of it, unfortunately. Oh, thank you so much. It is a medical magic murder mystery about a girl named Nika who has the ability to alter human anatomy with a touch. And she finds herself on the black market, bought and sold by a rich family to heal the last living witness of their father's murder. And along the way, she finds herself in a larger political plot than she imagined.
So I want to first ask if there was a scene or a line that stayed the same throughout drafting from kind of your first conception of the book to publication. And on the flip side, I guess, if there's one that like started off in the original, but then was cut like immediately or basically never made it through the process of editing. So Markel, do you want to start?
Yeah, so actually my first line of chapter 1 stayed the same from first draft all the way to publication. And the thing that didn't make it past was before chapter 1, I had a short prologue. And I lost that sometime during the querying process because it just wasn't like hooking agents to request more pages. And so I ended up taking that prologue and kind of weaving the things that were necessary, like kind of like background information, into chapter 1. But I was always able to keep that chapter 1 line the same, which I really like.
That's so cool. I was not able to keep chapter 1, line 1 the same. So that's amazing. For me, the plot line centers on this big heist trying to go get the huge stash of gold hidden in an underwater Las Vegas. And actually that whole core heist scene and set of chapters almost entirely stayed the same, maybe like 95%. That's kind of wild for me when I look back because many things did change. I wrote a whole new intro kind of chapter or two that kicks things off, I think, with a little more action and kind of sets the tone or promise of what the rest of the book is going to lay out better. The ending is actually different. When I got my agent, she brought up the ending, and I had kind of this wild twist ending originally. And I think in retrospect, it was kind of rushed, and it took away from the core adventure of the story, which is really sort of the genre that it embodies. And my agent asked if I was open to kind of halting just before that, so it kind of lands more squarely in adventure. And I thought about it a bunch, and I thought it was actually really great feedback. Part of why I really love working with my agent. So yeah, we built out character backstories in much richer ways, but anyway, the core climactic heist actually held the same, so that's been fun.
Yeah, I feel like a lot of my stuff actually stayed the same as well. I'm trying to think. Yeah, most of the main plot points stayed the same. I will say that my book features a houseboat, and I'm like obsessed with houseboats. Love those things. And I put a lot of scenes on the houseboat, and my editor was like, let's they're too safe there. Like let's raise the stakes and let's put them off the houseboat. It's too like comforting. So a lot of those scenes got moved to different locations and got like spliced up, and I wasn't able to keep many houseboat scenes except one. Um but yeah, other like Dinesh, a lot of my core moments kind of stayed the same.
They're like, get off the boat. You have to leave the boat at some point. I love that.
As someone who has a lot of boats in his book as well, I feel the need for scenes on boats. So I
Yeah,
hear you.
boats are amazing. Like it was so cozy there. Like, I didn't want to leave.
I want to ask now about kind of a large question, I know, which is what draws you to the speculative fiction genre as a whole, and what was the most influential book to date that has been in the speculative fiction genre for you? So, Dinesh, you want to start?
Yeah, I've kind of just always loved speculative fiction, and read a lot of particularly like post-apocalyptic and dystopian. In terms of like a classic book for me, it's got to be The Hunger Games, or even back then, like Maze Runner. I always loved. I just felt like it was so fast paced, and you just never knew what was going to happen chapter to chapter. And yeah, there's bits of kind of like there's probably bits of Hunger Games that have even seeped its way into the Sunken City. Like my two main characters, Jin and Tara, have a bit of a Katniss Prim dynamic where Jin is the older sister who's very protective of Tara, her younger sister. But unlike Hunger Games, Tara is along for the adventure, and Tara, I think, has a much more active role and gets into many more quarrels with her sister. Jin is actually like Tara's guardian as well, so it becomes a really complex relationship. So anyway, yeah, I've always loved dystopian, post-apocalyptic, and all this, and it's definitely it needed to come out of the fingers at some point too.
Yeah, for me, I love science or SFF speculative fiction and fantasy, or science fiction fantasy because it is like a little bit of what we know, but then you get to go crazy with it and just write what you want to write. And as someone who doesn't know about the real world very much, like I don't really know how. I don't know, our sewage system works. It's nice to be able to just make that up in a city rather than having to go research it. But I think one of the most formative, I think authors in general, not just books, is N.K. Jemisin with the fifth season because I didn't realize science fantasy existed until I read her works. And I read mostly her short stories because she writes amazing short stories. But when I read her book, that's really what inspired me to write science fantasy rather than just like science fiction or fantasy. And I think that's the only thing I've been writing since. So thank you, and K. Jemison.
I love what you said about being able to make things up instead of like researching a sewage system. That is like a wonderful reason to both write and read speculative fiction, I think. But I also think that the speculative fiction elements kind of add additional layers to a story. Like it's like elevated fiction. You can let your imagination run wild, but also use it to enhance like theme and character and like real world issues. And then as someone who writes retellings, I feel like speculative fiction lends a certain kind of endlessness to storytelling. Like a concept can be made new with the right speculative elements or interpretation. You can read like a dozen Cinderella retellings if if they're set in different worlds with different kinds of characters and different kinds of magic or science. So I really like that. I think the most influential speculative fiction book for me is The Scorpio Races by Maggie Stiefvater, because it's a book that has deadly water horses, but is also very character driven and exists in like a very contained setting. So the stakes are really high for the characters, but not the entire world. And those are the kind of fantasies that I like to read and the ones that I like to write most. So that's definitely always been an influential work.
Now that all of your books are published and they have debuted, I guess, I want to know what was the most surprising thing about release or publication now that you're a little bit of distance between, when your book came out and now. Vanessa, do you want to start?
Oh, yeah. I was hoping you wouldn't start with me because I'm trying to think. But let me think. I guess the most surprising thing is just not having to think about it anymore personally, because leading up to debut, they're always asking you to post little things or like talk in little places or do little interviews, and they're always running something by you, like, oh, here's a rollout schedule for every social media post for 3 months. Can you also post? And someone who doesn't like social media or talking very much, I didn't like that at all. But afterward, they just kind of take over, and the book is out there, and I felt like I didn't have to do anything to have it, continue spreading. I just had to, uh, I just had to write more. So I felt really good just to be able to put it out there and kind of look away and look towards my next project. So I guess that's the most surprising thing is how little I would think about it now that it's actually debuted.
Yeah, kind of in the same vein, the fact that like once it's out there, you have no more control over it really. Um, and like most surprising thing for me is that, yeah, it just kind of exists on its own in the world and people find it and buy it and read it without you really doing anything else. Um, so like, I guess it's really surprising that like, I don't know, publishing feels like such a fever dream sometimes. It's hard to imagine your book actually out in the world with complete strangers picking it up. So, yeah, it's surreal and very, very wonderful.
I'd add, I was really surprised, like how many messages I was getting from friends and family about the book. In my head, I'm sort of like, oh, this was written a bit ago, and yes, we did all these edits on it, but I've been writing for years, and then you sell the book, and it still takes maybe 2 years to come out. But then all of a sudden it was out, and then I was getting messages from old coworkers or from cousins of mine or from like friends from my kids' school, and they were like, my daughter read the book like this morning, like finished it before lunch, or like a friend was like, I stayed up until 2 a.m. because I just like couldn't stop at these chapters. So yeah, or friends who are kind of in like disbelief, like this was like a legit book, like it was. Yeah, I don't know. It was really special. I got some really sweet messages, and yeah, that always just kind of made my day.
Yeah, I've been monitoring the debut panels for a while now, and I think something that you hear a lot, or that I hear a lot as well, is kind of this free fall almost feeling after it's released, because there, as Vanessa was saying, there's so much that you're constantly doing until release date, and then all of it somehow release date hits, and then maybe a week after publication, and then it kind of just it allows to be its own product in the world. That's something you've all been saying. I feel like it's echoed a lot in people who have already debuted and talked with us on the panel. I want to dive into some themes a little bit more about your books. And Nanette, you already talked about the sisters a little bit in your book, since they're also the core of like the character dynamics. So I want to talk about the sisters in Into the Sunken City and Call Forth a Fox. And I want to know how you both created the sister side characters, the sister characters, and were they always the same throughout drafting? The same personalities, the sort of the same dynamic. Dinesh, you want to start because you were talking about the sisters before?
Yeah, of course. So I kind of talked on some Hunger Games inspiration there. I think the other big thing in my head was just I have a sister who's 3 years younger than me, and just thinking about our own dynamic and relationship, and trying to really then like channel that and put myself in the heads of Jin and Tara. And I felt like, okay, I'm an older sibling, if the older sibling was actually like the guardian, fully responsible for the younger one, and Tara in this case is 14, Jin's 18, I felt like I'd probably be becoming overly protective in places and be like limiting her freedom, and I'd be really worried about my sister. And then at the same time, I thought of my sister, and like she'd probably be pushing back on that pretty hard and giving me a lot of flack. And that would, we would love each other to death, but we'd also like get into it a little bit. So I think that kind of became a bit of the heart of the relationship between Jin and Tara, and like them going on the adventure and the journey. Like a big part of it is also like sorting through that and their feelings for each other, and where that needs to be. So yeah, that's been really fun, and I need to follow up with my sister to to see how I did.
Yeah, so the sisters in my novel are firstly based off of fairy tale characters. So Snow White and Rose Red is about two sisters, and the Snow White, for those of you who aren't familiar with the fairy tale, is not the same Snow White as the fairest of them all, Snow White. This is just happened to be another Snow White character. And so both of their attributes, first and foremost, were based off of their fairy tale counterparts. So Ro, my main character, she's based off Rose Red. She's the more wild and carefree of the two sisters. She's the one who's less traditionally feminine. She's a little bolder. And then Erwin, her older sister, is based off the Snow White character. And so she has like the fair hair, and she's a little more tidy. She's very kind. And then she has some more traditional aspects of femininity to her. But I didn't want to just stop at those like fairy tale like archetypes. I wanted to make sure that there was also nuance to their characters, because it's a novel. It's not just a few pages of a fairy tale. And so Erwin, for example, the older sister, she is like very traditionally feminine, but then she also uses a bow and arrow, and she avoids the forest not because she's too girly for it, but because it's tied up with grief over her father and the ideas for her future that he had that she doesn't really agree with. And so kind of just blending those fairy tale inspirations with more nuanced attributes so that it could sustain like character arcs. And both of their arcs pretty much stayed the same from the beginning. So in Ro's case, it's about learning to embrace change in your life and kind of like learn to accept that it's okay to outgrow a place that you love, and it's okay to embrace something new. And then for Erwin, it was kind of helping liberate her from that kind of like eldest sibling responsibility kind of position, where she is able to kind of have her own desires for her future that are kind of separate from being the older sister and being the responsible one. And yeah, those pretty much stayed the same throughout. It was just how that was depicted that would change with revisions and edits.
The own desires for the eldest sibling is like also something that's very much Into the Sunken City. So that's yeah, that's so cool to hear.
Yeah, as I was listening to you both talking about that, I obviously made the question because you both have sister characters. But then as you were both talking, I realized that there are so many similarities between kind of the dynamics between older overprotectiveness, but also the whole family structures are pretty similar. So hopefully, if we have time, we can go back to that. I'll let that question percolate a little bit. I want to talk now about The Last Blood Carver because your book has a lot of revenge and sacrifice, and both of these two kind of themes are interacting with each other in a variety of different characters, not only your main character, but in the side characters as well. So I wanted to know if you could talk about how you're examining those themes in relation to the characters, and specifically when you talk about power, since your book has the science fantasy, as we were talking about, and like the power of the magic.
Yeah, so I think the sacrifice theme is very directly related with the magic because when you're healing people in my magic system, you expend, calories and macromolecules of your own self if you're not stealing it from them, which is also something that happens in the book. But when I was writing a story about healing, I wanted not only to, because I love hard science magic, hard magic. So I really wanted not only a very biochemical aspect to how it works, but also I think that metaphor plays in nicely with the story because you are giving a part of yourself to heal. And we start with a very selfish main character, selfish by necessity. And over time, she learns to open up and give more of herself and be more, um, genuine with the people around her. And the story culminates with, many sacrifices. And I think that was a very good way for me to express what I wanted to express with her character journey of becoming more selfless and more interconnected with other people. As for revenge, I actually never thought about revenge as a theme of my novel, so that's really interesting. But now that you do mention it, yeah, it is kind of a revenge plot. So yeah, it's like a revenge vindication plot. But one of the characters who is in a position of power desires revenge, even if it may hurt people who are just trying to survive and people who don't have as much influence as she does. So I think in that regard, because my book is talking about power dynamics between um, a minority group and a majority group. It's very interesting to think about because, in many ways, the character desiring revenge is a very spoiled character, kind of based after myself. And she, doesn't care who she hurts at moments to get what she wants, and that comes through with, the decisions she makes to um, get her justice.
Yeah, and I'm glad you pointed that out too, because when I was thinking when I when I was thinking about revenge in relation to your book as well, it was interesting because I mean you're the one, as you said, with the side character, it's obviously wanting revenge, but then it puts the main character in that position where it has those layers of power, not only in terms of minority and majority group, but also in the ways that like she almost becomes a tool for revenge. Do you know what I mean? Like her power exploited in a way that lacks true agency, I guess, however you want to call it, like agency or free will or whatever. But yeah, that's when I was thinking about the question, I was thinking about like all of those messy kind of layers that you're playing with as you were talking in the world building.
Yeah, one of the big themes that I was trying to incorporate was the idea of like appropriation and appreciation for a culture, because the magic system is a metaphor-ish for culture in the book, and the book is about like acculturation and coming into a world and like what you sacrifice if you have to um, acculturate to a new place, especially as a second gen immigrant. So yeah, in like you mentioned, in trying to seek her revenge, this character really appropriates the power system rather than appreciating it as it's meant to be used, um, which gets a little dicey. But yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I actually never noticed.
I also want to talk because you mentioned as well, Vanessa, about the sewage system, which of course, yes, I would also very much not want to do a lot of the nitty-gritty like research into a variety of things that are like truly necessary for my survival, but honestly just so complicated. But I want to talk about how in the last blood carver and Into the Sunken City, you're both creating such rich worlds in which like I would imagine a lot of thinking goes, for example, boats, just boats and like water thinking, and also in terms of kind of creating a city from scratch and like how you do all of those things. So I wanted to know from both of you, what was the research process like for the bits that you had to research, and how did these settings change or evolve throughout the research process? Vanessa, do you want to start, because I was talking about sewage systems?
Yeah, this might be a little bit of a long-winded answer, so I apologize. But for me, I really respect writers who build a world that is so complex and complete in their head. For me, world building is vibes and metaphor. What I really like to do with world building is to make an extended metaphor. So when I was writing this book, I knew it was a story about a second gen immigrant, or like the fantasy version of that, and I knew I really wanted to talk about what happens when you have to give up a little bit of your culture in order to fit in. So when I was thinking about that, I was like, okay, I want to build a world that is a metaphor for the American dream. And so, in many ways, I was like, okay, meritocratic city, because in the American dream, you're told work hard and you profit. So I was like, okay, it's a meritocracy. And then I was also thinking, like, meritocracy, what does that like embody? And I was thinking, like, oh, it's very steampunk, right? Because I feel like the Industrial Revolution is very much the symbol of American meritocracy. So I went with that, and that's how I got my silk punk esque vibes from that. But I also really wanted to build a world that was very much like me, which is like very Asian, but also very American, and maybe even more so American. So I wrote this world that is kind of on that fence of being both Western and Eastern, I suppose. And it really is an extended metaphor for the American dream, because everyone in this world is told if you work hard, you can rise through the ranks and anyone can succeed. But the main character, in entering the high social life of this world and masking her identity to solve this murder, she realizes that there's a lot of prejudice and racism that makes it not always so clear cut. But yeah, that's kind of how I got my world. Research wise, yeah, I just searched up like American Revolution, and then because it was very medically based, I wanted to put it around the time of the specifically the medical revolution as well, which is kind of not the same period, but has a lot of cool innovations like aseptic methods of surgery. So not everyone was dying of fever and sepsis every surgery, but yeah. So it's mostly like very scattered research, but I swear it's there a little bit.
Yeah, I went down some real research rabbit holes for Into the Sunken City, not on sewage systems exactly. Although I did have to think, so again, it's set in a world that's always raining and sea levels have risen massively, about 4,000 feet. So I did have to think, like, as it's always raining, what happens to soil, to topsoil? It probably gets washed out. Like, does that water all just collect on the ground? And so, not exactly sewage systems, but started to imagine like how it would flow out under the ground and get pumped out to sea. And yeah, there were just all sorts of things that kind of spiraled out of this, because clouds cover the entire world, less sunlight gets through. And so I started to think like, well, what crops grow in lower light conditions, in like saltier, more brackish water. And so I found out that barley actually does that. And so barley is the like staple grain they use. And you'll see a few barley references in the book if you're a barley fan. Anyway, so there were just a lot of things like this. I imagine that because it's incredibly difficult to grow trees, the price of wood would be very high. So for materials, they mostly use plastics. And so most oil is used for plastics and it's not used as a fuel. But there's a lot of water, so they use hydropower in the world. So I tried to just kind of like cascade it out as much as I could. And then parts of it I just got really geeky with. There were some online tools where I was able to like input the actual sea level for into the sunken city. It was 1,350 meters, 1,350 meters, and then see what the earth looks like, what mountains are still above the water with that type of sea level. And then, very specifically plot with that in mind. And so they land on islands that are essentially like mountains in today's world, things like this. And all of that was really fun. I got into it. Also the ocean creatures, went on some real tangents with those: jellyfish, eels, squid, realizing that some squid can like communicate with each other by changing the colors of their bodies. There's just fun stuff out there. And like 80% maybe I'd say of the sea creatures are real. And then I kind of hyperbolized about 20% of them, imagining there's some undiscovered stuff that's gonna come to light.
Yeah, as I was reading your book, I remembered this conversation I had with London Shaw, who wrote The Light at the Bottom of the World. We were also talking about like what colors of light there would be and what kind of, in terms of glare, would there be glare, would there not be glare, what kinds of pressurization are you thinking when you're going that far? It's just like a lot of big brain stuff.
Yeah, the deep sea diving got really wild. I've done some free diving and scuba diving myself, but they're in these exoskeletons that are, and then like 2,000 to 3,000 feet below sea level, and the pressure there is, they're dealing with like dozens of atmospheres of pressure versus just what we have on land. And so at a certain point I realized on my website, I was like, I need to go put claustrophobia and trigger warnings, like it gets very tense when it's so dark and there's so much pressure bearing down on you, and when you're surrounded by pirates. It was fun.
As we've discussed before, Call Forth the Fox and also Into the Sunken City are both retellings of obviously different source material. But I would love to know from both of you, when you were approaching the retelling, how did you pick elements you knew you wanted to keep? How did you pick elements you knew you wanted to change? And sort of how that process occurred. Mikhail, do you want to start?
Yeah, so to put it simply, I changed what frustrated me and I kept what I loved. So what I love about the original fairy tale Snow White and Rose Red is the sisterhood. I love how the sisters are very different from each other, but then also support one another and show each other kindness and work through and around those differences that they have to work together and find common ground. And so that's something that I definitely wanted to keep with my reimagining. And I also loved the aspect of the animal transformation. I think that was just like a really cool physical representation of magic that I wanted to keep. But I did know that in the original fairy tale, the bear is a bear for most of the story. And I knew that wouldn't really work as well with the young adult story. So I decided to have the bear transform kind of back and forth into a boy and a bear throughout the story instead of keeping him as one thing, because that would make for kind of like a more interesting, realistic, like YA story. And then as far as like big changes, so the thing that frustrates me most about Snow White and Rose Red is how much queer subtext I find in it, but then also how that queer subtext is like never brought to the surface in the fairy tale, and in fact is kind of like pushed down by the ending. The ending of the original fairy tale, the Snow White marries the prince, or like the bear who becomes transforms back into a prince, and then Rose Red marries his brother, which is a character you never meet in the fairy tale. He doesn't have a name, like he has no persona, nothing. And it's almost like that like traditional patriarchal heteronormativity kind of just like stamps out any of the queer subtext that you could read through the fairy tale. And so the biggest change I made was bringing that subtext to the surface and making Rose Red a bi main character who experiences a sapphic romance. And then also neither of the girls end up married to anyone at the end because they're teenagers and they don't need to be married. And so that frustration is really what fueled a lot of the retelling. So I feel like I can't really retell any fairy tale that I don't both love and feel frustrated by, because those are both like just like equal sources of fuel for like my imagination.
I love that response, and we've got so many similarities. So completely agree with like kept the things I loved and ditched the hated. You said it so well, Markel. I had reread Treasure Island during the pandemic. I was a stay-at-home dad with my two kids. They were like 2 and 4, so my wife had like a really busy big job as like a school administrator, and things were a little wild at home, and I needed some night escapism, and Treasure Island was like totally delivering. It was just like the voice, the action, the pace, like I was super into it. But I had and so I wanted to keep a lot of that. I had this idea for an always raining world. And one fine day, like the idea of the Treasure Island casino in Las Vegas popped into my head. And then I started to think like, okay, sea levels are probably going to be raised in this world. And then that was kind of the birth of the plot. And I started to think like, okay, they're going to be going into an underwater Las Vegas. But yeah, as I reread I'd read the original Treasure Island as a kid as well, but as I was rereading it, I kind of felt like one, I didn't love the character arc of Jim in the book. He kind of like, he starts out as a innkeeper's son and goes on the adventure, but sort of like instantly courageous. And not instantly, but you're sort of like, why does that happen? Or what's he learning? What's he overcoming? And I like my main characters who are like a little messy, just make a lot of mistakes. And so Jin is more that type of character where like, she's brave and fearless and is a real survivor, but she's also messed some things up and has some like worldviews that have gotten a bit twisted, particularly because she's had so much responsibility to shoulder. So I wanted just a richer character arc, quite frankly. The other piece was Treasure Island is written in like the late 1800s, and literally like every character in the book is a white man, except for Jim's mom. And it gets a little ridiculous at a certain point because like, you know, early on you're reading the book and they'll be like a tall, dark, nut brown man walked into the inn, and you're like, oh, okay. And then you're like, oh, this is actually just a tan white guy. You know, it's like you kind of find out a few pages later. Or sail across the Atlantic to Treasure Island. They find someone living on the island. Oop, are you all there? They find someone, and that person is not a native person to the island. That person is actually just a white guy that got left behind on a previous trip. So you start to feel like come on, we could have done more. Anyway, this is to center the relationship onto sisters. I wanted to incorporate queer relationships and just have a much more diverse world.
I forgot to also remind people, if you have any questions, to put them in the chat. I got too excited by my own questions. And on that note, I'm going to ask some more questions while you have some time to think about it. I want to ask about the sequel to The Last Blood Carver, mostly because I think if anyone has read the book already, they will know well, they'll also have the same question. So I wanted to know, because it is a duology, I wanted to know when you were first thinking of when the first image of the book came to you, did you always know it was going to be a duology, or like how did you, if so, did you kind of like take one idea and then kind of split it into two, or did you always know that it was going to be two? I find like the breaking up of books in series really fascinating, and when people choose to sort of like devastate people at the end.
I don't know. I wouldn't call it devastating. I would call it, very kind actually. But let me think. Yeah, I think when I definitely knew it was going to be a duology because I remember when querying, I had that ending, and when I was actually querying, which is kind of ill-advised, I'd already written about half of the next book, which looked very different from what it looks like now, for the better. But I think for me, duologies are a perfect medium, right? Because I never feel like I can explore everything I want to explore in one book, but at the same time, if I had written 3 books, I would be so sad right now because I would just want to move on from that world, and I just don't really have patience for 3 books. But for me, both the first book and the second book is one story, and I think the ending was a pretty obvious place to end the first book. But at the same time, um, I don't think anyone's character arcs are perfectly where I want them to be by the end of the first book, and I think that's okay. That being said, when I'm writing duologies, I really like to be able to wrap it up so that it can stand alone as one book. So if people want to stop there, they can. They would just receive a vastly different ending and tone to what I wanted to write than what I had intended for the whole thing, which is fine. That's their prerogative. But I think for me, duologies and everything I've kind of written since has come to me in a duology format. But duologies are just so perfect because you get about 200,000 words, give or take, to tell a very expansive story. But you do it in a way where audiences don't get bored reading the perspective of just one character. And the next book, it is up on Goodreads. It's not officially announced, but if people are very interested, I would say don't look at it until you've read the first book because of major spoilers. But it is from the perspective of 2 characters this time, and I am really excited to put it out there because it was really fun to write. So, yeah, there's that.
Yeah, I love what you were saying about viewing it in terms of like a story that also could be ended, but also that it's not yet ended kind of for a character. I think there are like 2 different camps in terms of series, where ones where you can read each installment and they feel somewhat resolved, but there's still obviously more, and then ones that just kind of like drop you off a cliff and then end page like, you know what I mean, and just cut the screen. I want to know from you all, who was the hardest and easiest character to write in your stories? Markel, do you want to start?
Sure. So the easiest character to write was definitely my main character, Ro, because she and I are a lot of like. So I didn't have to do as much like teasing out of like who she was and what I wanted her character arc to be, because it's a character arc that is very much inspired by like my own experience. Um, one of the big things she faces in the novel is that she doesn't want to move from her childhood home to a new place. And while I was drafting the book, I was actually in the process of moving from my childhood home across the country to a new place. And so I was able to pour a lot of those like conflicting feelings, like the excitement about something new, but then the heartache about leaving something you love. I was able to pour a lot of that into her character. And so that was like a very like both like easy thing to do, but then also very cathartic thing to do. But when it comes to the hardest character, it was definitely the story's villain. Mostly just because I don't find villains as interesting to read or write about as heroes or just like regular, like flawed, nuanced people. And so I actually tried to avoid introducing the villain as much as possible in early drafts of the story, like just kind of like just like reveal toward the end, tack it on, and then things can be resolved. But my editor made a really good point that that pacing was terrible. It needed to be restructured, and so I had to introduce him a lot earlier, and that was probably the most challenging aspect of the editing process, was like really spending time with that character and like trying to make them present on the page, even though the villain aspect is not as exciting for me.
Oh my gosh, too many similarities, Markel. This is really wild. Villain is, was absolutely my toughest character to write too. Long John Silver is in the original Treasure Island, and here we have a Brazilian Joao Silva. And my editor actually, a lot of credit to her. She really pushed me to like build out his backstory more. And she had this idea that like there could be a bit of mystery behind his backstory, and maybe we need to uncover this. And it helps to inform like how Jin can survive in their interactions. A brilliant idea that was incredibly difficult to do, quite frankly, because I felt like, okay, I have this thing written, but I now need to like carefully layer this in across 10 different chapters. And I found that really challenging, but also I've now heard from several folks that like he was one of their favorite characters and like really loved the depth that he brought and what that then kind of showed about Jin. So anyway, that I'm glad that worked out. Easiest character to write for me, also maybe I shouldn't say that. Well, is a character who you're sort of unsure whether to trust. Her name's Billy, based on Billy Bones, who again was in the original Treasure Island. And Billy is a bit of like a Jack Sparrow character, is just kind of like a strange drifter, could kind of do anything at any moment, and I just was able to have a lot of fun with that. I did like a podcast with Marissa Meyer, and she described Billy. She had given a blurb for the book, and she described Billy as just like a splash of color on every page, in what is actually like a pretty bleak, cloud-covered world. So anyway, Billy was a lot of fun.
Actually, I had a different answer for who was the hardest to write, but now that you mention it, it's definitely a villain. Markel, because they're just because they have to be the antithesis of well, I guess they don't have to be, but usually they are the antithesis of who the hero is, and we put ourselves in the shoes of the hero so often that we struggle sometimes to find the opposite perspective and write it in a compelling way. And I think my villain was someone who changed a lot during the process, for the better, and my editor really helped me with that. But in terms of favorite character to write, Dinesh, you mentioned that you love writing messy characters, and I will agree. Like, messy characters are the most fun characters. I love when characters just, do insane things that I would never do and mess up and have fun with it. And in that regard, I think my main character, Nika, was the most fun to write. Um, One, because she's very opposite myself. I feel like don't like I'm a people pleaser, and she's very mean to people, and she just says what she wants to say. So it's very cathartic to write her because I just like writing my true thoughts. But in that regard, she was really fun because she's messy and she messes up, and um in many ways, the narrative gives her grace for messing up, and being a little petulant and outspoken. But yeah, that was really fun and cathartic to write.
I just want to say that I feel so validated by this conversation because I hear from so many writers how much fun and how easy it is to write their villains. And I'm always just like, not me. And so I really love hearing that your villains were challenging to write too. And I loved that point, Vanessa, you made about how, yeah, they're supposed to be they're often in opposition to your main character, and your main character is the one you usually start with or identify with most in the story. And so, yeah, it can be really hard to place yourself in opposite shoes when it's like what you're working against. It's almost like a battle. And so that's really insightful.
I want to ask about absent parent figures, and yet another similarity between Call Forth the Fox and Into the Sunken City is your absent in different ways parental figures. We talked already about being a guardian for your younger sister, and then also I don't know if we talked as much in Call Forth the Fox about the absent parent, but I'd love to know from both of you how you created a side character who we don't see as much. How do you create kind of that history and that relationship? This was unprompted, so I feel really bad like calling on someone to start.
Yeah, I can jump in. So in Into the Sunken City, Jin's mom passed when she was quite young, but she was very close with her dad, and her dad passed about 3 years before the book begins. And then she becomes the guardian for her younger sister, Tara. And she just has a lot of messy feelings about her dad. On the one hand, they were incredibly close. She admired him greatly, and he was a big diver as well, taught her to dive, has kind of like special memories of like ways where he kind of just went out of his way to help her with things, to teach her certain lessons. So there's a lot of love and warmth, but at the same time, she feels like he was kind of reckless with his life. He did this thing that was very dangerous, and they own an inn. He didn't have to do this thing. And so there's just a lot of unresolved feelings. They go out to like celebrate the anniversary of his death, and they very early on in the book, so not spoiler by any means, but they like drop some items of his into the sea. And anyway, that grief and the responsibility that had been thrust on Jin was a big driver in her character arc, in some of the things that got a little twisted for her. And so I wanted to make sure that was shown well through that relationship. And then, I should mention my father-in-law passed away almost 10 years ago now. But, in a lot of the scenes that were really heavy on grief, I just remember like thinking about him a lot and just how much we still miss him. So yeah, you pour a lot of yourself into all your different characters and their relationships.
Yeah, so in the original fairy tale Snow White and Rose Red, there is no father present. And so that was something right away I knew I was going to continue with, but make him more of a character on the page, even though he is gone, he has passed away. When it comes to the mother character, she's actually in most of the fairy tale. But when I thought about how in the original fairy tale, the mom's like, sure, Bear, you can come live with my kids in our cottage for the winter. I just was like, no way is anyone buying that. Like, that's like too ridiculous. So I was like, okay, I need to remove her. But I also wanted her to be present too. So kind of the different ways I made both parents still present in the narrative was that the mom, who is away for the winter, kind of like looking for a better life for the family, like trying to settle in a new place. She's kind of more of like the moral compass for the two sisters. And it's kind of like in this situation, what would our mom do? And is that something that we want to also do, or something we want to rebel against and not do? So it's kind of those like in big decision-making moments, like, are we going to do what we think our mother would do, or are we going to do the opposite because she's not here? So we have the chance to do that. And so that's how she's like kind of a guide through the story. And then when it comes to the father, it's kind of, I developed it in two different ways. So in one, it is the different relationships that the two sisters had with their father, and how that kind of serves to be a conduit for the sisters to like work through their differences and the different things that they want for their lives, because both of them remember their childhoods very differently and had very different relationships with their father. And that kind of has to come to the surface because of the events of the story. And it's something that the sisters have to work out with each other. And there's also a lot of, with it, all the like mysteries and the things to do with fairies and fairy lore. That's something they have to look to the past and the stories that their father raised them on in order to solve. So he's also the source of helping them figure out what's going on with the curse and like how to break the curses and like how to interact with these fairies of the wood that they themselves, at least one of the sisters, didn't really believe in. The other did, but neither of them ever thought that they'd really be confronting that kind of situation. And so they have to use the memory of their father in order to work through those things. And so that's the two ways I made the parents present without actually having them present. But then I also wanted to have some kind of parental presence in the story because they are still very young, and there's times when they can't figure it out on their own and they need someone to turn to. And so there's a pair of neighbors that are kind of like the queer elders, especially for my main character, Ro. And they're able to kind of support her and be that parental presence for her to turn to in times of like serious conflict and not knowing where else to turn.
I love your point on the sisters having different relationships with a parental figure. Like for Jin and Tara, they imagine they think back on their relationship with the father similarly, but after he passed, they both kind of took different things away from it. Like Tara became like very hopeful and very like, gotta go out and live life. And Jin became more like, I gotta hunker down and survive. And so that creates a lot of tension. One other thing I wanted to just mention, just because we're talking about messy characters and grief, and I just can't help but think of You've Reached Sam. Have any of y'all read that? Just like a beautiful book where the main character's boyfriend has just passed away, and she kind of makes a lot of missteps and is dealing with a lot of grief along the way. Anyway, one I loved over the last year or two.
Okay, and my last question is about The Last Blood Carver, mostly because, Vanessa, I feel like you talked a little bit tangentially about, I think I'm awful with character names. I just want to preface what I'm going to say, but I think Mimi, right, is the character you're talking about. Yeah, I wanted to know if you could share a little bit of insight about how you created Mimi and her family, who are really central side characters, because of how you were talking about earlier, right? Like the layers of appropriation and appreciation and this kind of messy relationship between like the whole group of them. And I was interested to know how you came up with Mimi and Mimi's family characters.
Yeah, so let me think. Mimi, Andao, and Trin are this kind of trio. Mimi and Andao are their siblings. Trin is Andao's boyfriend and bodyguard-ish. But they form this little triumvirate of what our main character kind of aspires toward in terms of family, wealth in particular, and just overall closeness that she tries to come in on. But I am someone who has 3 brothers, so in everything I write, I always find that I'm writing older brother, younger sister relationships. Even though I'm the older sister, I like to write a younger sister. Um, but so I really started with the idea of the siblings first, Mimi and Andao, and I really like the idea of like a stern, protective older brother. But like I mentioned, Mimi is really based in some ways off myself, where she's kind of spoiled, rotten, and entitled, and maybe not a great testament to my character. But she was very much um, just this person who has been used to getting everything she wants and is facing grief for the first time and tragedy for the first time in her entire life and doesn't really know how to grapple with that. But one of the biggest reasons I invented this family was because I wanted to give Nika not only something to look into, but something to represent her desire to acculturate to the culture of the city. But in what they ask her to do, in order to fit in, they're asking her to, deny and renounce a really vital part of herself, which is her magic system. And at the same time that they're asking her to renounce it, they're asking her to use it for their sake, but to hide it for her sake. And they're very well intentioned people. They're not villains by any means, even though they are a little selfish and ignorant. So I really wanted to display that complex relationship between an immigrant and their their new country, where in many ways we're told to not really be ourselves, but at the same time to be ourselves in service to the new country. So that was what I was trying to go for in the relationship between Nika and these siblings, where they are an example of cultural appropriation in many ways, and them being them and appropriative really parallels the true home that Nika finds with someone who is not appropriating her but truly appreciating her. So yeah, I definitely added a lot of my siblings and myself in that relationship, but hopefully we're not as bad as as that. Um, but yeah, that was their inspiration.
Yeah, no, I loved, as I said earlier, yeah, seeing the layers of the different relationships that all these new people she meets, and like how she figures out how to trust them, and like how to realize sometimes we can't, even if we want to trust someone, we can't like really necessarily trust them and their intentions. So obviously I could talk about all these books for like ever. But I just wanted to thank everyone for watching, and I wanted to thank all of my lovely panelists for joining me and humoring all of my questions. I've left everyone's book links down below, so definitely please go pick them up, add them, share them, enjoy them as much as I have. And I hope you all have a good rest of your day wherever you are. Bye, everybody.